Right, are we ready then? Can we start?
We're good to
now?
go. We're going. We're live.
Right. Hello and welcome to.
Okay, I think.
Hugh, shut up. Good Lord.
If I can accept this as a normal human emotion and that it will come and it will pass and I'll have tricky thoughts or feelings, I can start to make room for them.
Hello and welcome to another fun-filled episode of 80% Mental, the world's premier sports psychology podcast. I think I can say that. Can I say that now?
Yeah.
We're a few episodes in. I think I can say we're the world's premier sports psych podcast. My name's Dr. Pete Olushaga and Hugh Gilmore's here as well. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, Pete. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. A few technical difficulties on this one, but we're here now.
Yeah. So, you looked as if you were going to say something.
So if you're one of our regular listeners, which I'm sure we have probably thousands of by now, you're probably familiar with what we're doing. But if you're new to the show, each week we start by asking a question about the psychology of sport. And then we set about trying to answer that question, normally with the help of some special guests who may or may not be experts. This week's question is one that I think will resonate with everyone, with athletes, with coaches, parents, students, people going on first dates, whoever. And that question is, why do we get nervous and what can we do about it? And to help us answer that question, we've got not one, but two special guests who I can confidently say are experts. First of all, we have Dr. Josephine Perry, a sports psychologist and writer. Josie works with amateur and elite athletes and those in the performing arts as well. And we've spoken about the balance between well-being and performance a couple of times on the show already. And Josie, well-being plays a really important role in your work. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really strong on the fact that you can't be a great athlete until you're a happy person, and you need to feel really good in yourself before you can go out and perform well.
And you've written a book as well on sports psychology, Performing Under Pressure, yeah?
Yes, so that was the book that I kind of wish I had when I trained, of the key aspects like you guys are doing, of asking those questions about the big issues in sports psychology and what you would do about each of those issues. What kind of activities, what strategies might you put in place? So it was a book to answer all that stuff that I wish I'd have had when I was training.
So a great resource for any students who are listening, maybe. Our second guest is Joe Davies, a sport and exercise psychologist. Again, and Joe runs a private practice consultancy focusing on sports psychology, well-being and personal development. Again, Joe supports all sorts of athletes from amateurs through to elite sports people and works with a lot of junior athletes as well. And Joe, you work with the military as well, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. So Army sport athletes, predominantly the Army boxing team and Army target shooting team. But there's also some elite individuals who are representing the Army at a very professional level as well.
Wow, awesome. So again, we're seeing different applications of sports psychology in different environments.
Yeah, for sure.
Before we get to this week's question, which is, again, why we get nervous, and we're going to explore that in some depth, I think we should clarify up front that actually anxiety is something that we all experience from time to time. And I'm sure that we've all come across people who claim that they just don't get nervous, which we all know is complete nonsense because we all do. But I just wanted to kind of get that out there early on, that everybody experiences anxiety. So we thought what we'd do today is introduce a little bit of a competition element to what we're doing. I can see some worried faces already. And we're going to have a quiz during the episode. So we're going to have 4 questions that we're going to spread out throughout the show, and you can play along at home if you want to, but it wouldn't be a competition if we didn't have a prize. So the prize for this competition is that the winner gets to choose which of the losers does a 20-second freestyle rap about sports psychology.
Okay, Pete, this has just reached a new low, but that's fine by me.
I think this is going to be a high.
I sort of hope I get picked, but also hoping I don't get picked. I'm not sure where I'm at the moment.
I'm just going to say, if you want your ratings to go through the floor, you ask a 43-year-old mum to do that.
I don't know. It could work out absolutely fine. Well, you know, added incentive to do well on the quiz then, I suppose.
Exactly.
Okay, so I mean, my first question is like, how are we all feeling now?
A little bit excited, a bit apprehensive. I definitely felt a bit nervous half an hour ago when I was first coming on, and actually now the hilarity of the technology going wrong has put me at ease. But yeah, you know, Pete, when you said anxiety is an everyday human experience, I would absolutely agree.
And Josie, Hugh, how are you feeling now that I've introduced the element of rap into today's episode?
Yeah, I am one of those people that tends to say I don't really get particularly nervous. But yeah, I think that would bring it on, certainly.
Well, Pete, you know, not only am I great at rapping, I also am very good at quizzes. So I ain't got no problems here.
Fair enough. Well, we'll see how we'll get
Confident
on.
talk.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we've kind of introduced that little element of competition, and there's a prize and something at stake now. So, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. How is that anxiety maybe manifesting itself now? What are we thinking about? What sort of sensations might come up? How does anxiety actually manifest itself?
I guess normally what we experience, which is definitely what I experienced, Pete, when you started to introduce the competitive element and the consequence, was both what we call some cognitive anxiety, so some mindset elements of anxiety, which some thoughts around, oh gosh, I wasn't expecting that. So there's already some uncertainty in my mind of what's going to come up. There's definitely some emotional thoughts around, Joe, you will look like an absolute idiot if you try to rap on a podcast. I might not. Let's see. But equally, there's you know, what we call somatic anxiety, which we define as some physiology changes in our body. Yeah. So I definitely noticed my heart race a little bit when you talked about the competitive element, and I think I've got some sweaty palms going on here, Pete.
So it's kind of typical, you call them somatic symptoms. So how we perceive what our body's doing, the physiological responses, the butterflies, the sweaty palms, the kind of heart racing, etc. And then there's the cognitive anxiety, the mental anxiety, I guess, the way you might think, the sort of self-doubt that maybe creeps in. Am I going to be a good enough rapper for the 80% Mental podcast? Yeah. Josie, what about yourself? Anything to kind of add?
I think actually it was a very clever way to introduce the subject, because when we're looking at anxiety and looking at stress, that comes from seeing that there are stressors in our environment and not feeling like we're capable of dealing with them. And I can quite honestly say rapping would be a stressor for me, and I certainly don't have the capabilities to deal with it, to manage with it. And when you get to that point of realising you can't manage or cope with what's in front of you, that's when that anxiety kicks in. And it's certainly a big enough threat to me, to my ego, that I would start to have some of my anxiety kicking off. I would start to feel definitely under threat, that there's a fear of failure, there's certainly a fear of embarrassment, a fear of judgment coming along, that would put me into that state of anxiety.
So just while we're on that, I wanted to touch on the difference between anxiety and stress, because people use that term fairly interchangeably, don't they? And people talk about anxiety, stress, nerves. In what ways are anxiety and stress different things?
So I always explain it when I work with athletes that we have stressors, we have stress, and then we have anxiety. And so you may have many, many different stressors in your life. Whether we feel able to cope with them is whether we get stressed. So, for example, Jo is phenomenal on a horse. She works a lot with equestrian riders. She's lived in that world a long time. So the stressors she might see when she goes along to a horse competition, she can look around and go, yeah, I can handle everything here. If I turned up to that same horse competition, I would be utterly terrified. There is no way I could handle that. I've been on a horse once in my life when I was a child, never again. So I would have exactly the same stressors that Jo has got in front of her, but we would react incredibly differently. And to me, it would be a stressful experience. And anxiety is the reaction to that stress. So anxiety is seeing that there is a threat there and I don't have the capacity to deal with that threat. And so I want to run away, I want to fight it, I want to freeze and hide.
Okay, so I'm curious, like we mentioned the terms cognitive and somatic. For a beginner, like what actually are those terms? They're big psychological words. And are they the same thing or are they separate?
In my experience, Hugh, they often occur together, but there is a distinction between how we would define them, right? So somatic anxiety would be the physiological symptoms that we feel of anxiety. So that might be anything from my heart rate increases to I feel butterflies in my tummy, I feel hot and sweaty, my senses are on high alert. Cognitive anxiety, on the other hand, would be the mental elements of anxiety. So that might be tricky thoughts that come, like I don't want to fail, I don't want to let my team down. It may also be images that come up, whether that is remembering a previous negative experience when I'm competing in sport, that I messed up, I made a mistake in this environment, or our mind may take us into the future and anticipate a worst case scenario. Yeah, so me not qualifying today, or me making huge mistakes today. But in my experience, often they occur together, not always. So some athletes we see have more cognitive or more somatic symptoms than others.
And I think what makes it really tricky is when they often are occurring together, it feels like a vicious cycle. So your brain is telling you there's loads of stuff to worry about. You're under threat. There's things that could go wrong. You could make a fool of yourself. And that is triggering those physiological elements of your body. So you're breathing faster, your heart rate goes up, your muscles tense up because you've got that cortisol, you've got that adrenaline flooding your body. But because it's all flooding your body and your heart rate's gone up, that's your body telling your brain that something is wrong and there's something to be worried about. And it can end up in this really vicious cycle.
I'd absolutely agree with that, Josie. I think something I commonly see in athletes is almost anxiety around anxiety. So I anticipate feeling anxious. I don't like that feeling. Therefore, I might avoid that situation that makes me feel that way. Or I might try and push those feelings away, which actually sometimes only intensifies those feelings.
It's interesting that you talk about the two types, I guess, of anxiety being experienced together quite a lot and that they reinforce each other. Based on your experience, do you think that there's one comes first, or is it like a chicken and egg situation?
Personally, I don't tend to get much cognitive anxiety, but I get a lot of somatic anxiety. So I will feel that I am anxious before I realise I am. And a really lovely technique I like using with people is we do a breathing technique, but during that technique you start focusing on something that has made you anxious lately, and then you start to listen out in your body of where you're feeling that anxiety. And people can then get really good at being able to pinpoint where they feel anxiety in their body, and that can become a trigger to realise when something's wrong. And so it's really good in sport or the rest of life that for me it's my lower stomach. I can literally pinpoint when that starts to ache. Hang on, something's wrong. I need to look through my to-do list. What's making me worried right now? Because something clearly is. And so it's a really good way to deal with kind of, I guess, longer term chronic stress in your life, because you can feel it long before you've had that moment to sit there and realise what it is that's going on.
And that's something that anybody who's listening can just try.
It's a brilliant technique, and you just start with a usual breathing technique of slowing down your breathing. But after a while, after you've got into a good rhythm, really start to think about something that's made you anxious lately. And while you're thinking about it, then tap into, where am I feeling this? So some people it'll be across their shoulders, some people will start to get backache, some people will feel it in their head, and quite a few of us will feel it in our stomach. But it's a really good way to understand where you notice stress, so that you can pick it up a lot earlier than you might do if it was actually half an hour before the thing that's likely to make you anxious.
One of the things that's interesting about your story, about where you feel your anxiety, is I worked very closely with a physio who was preparing an athlete for the Olympics in Rio, and this athlete came in with back pain, and the physio assessed her and said there was nothing wrong with her back, and then turned around and said to her, look, I think we both know the problem is that you're pissed off and angry and annoyed about things, and that happens to correlate with having a sore back. And I suppose it's interesting how we can somatize our emotions and feelings into physical sensations. Yeah, it was just a random story.
It was a good one. I liked it.
Yeah, it's kind of that feeling, thinking, linking. I think. So sorry, I think I butted in there. But Josie's point, and I guess your point here, is around this self-awareness, right? Like as an athlete, can I pick up on these things earlier so that I can process them, so that I can work with them, rather than waiting until they build to a much more intense level, and then I'm kind of in trouble.
So I guess now is probably a good time to remind everybody of the impending competition, and to kick us off with one of the first quiz questions. So question 1, and you can write your answers down or just kind of try and remember them. Which footballer was charged with assault for executing a perfect flying kung fu kick on a fan in 1995?
I'm not sure I need to write that down or remember, because I have absolutely no idea. I'm showing my cards now.
And what I think we'll do is I think we'll have question 2 now as well. So question 2, Serena Williams is the greatest athlete of all time. That's just without question. But how many times has Serena Williams won Wimbledon?
I've got her autobiography on my bedside table and I've not yet read it.
Timing. I can make it multiple choice if you think that would be fairer.
Yeah, let's just go for it.
Okay, fair enough.
Oh,
I'm not confident.
And for a bonus point as well, Serena Williams is second in the all-time wins in the ladies singles finals. Who's first? It's for a bonus point. Right, so how's that anxiety now?
Yeah, a little bit elevated. My general knowledge is not great.
We've talked a little bit already about what anxiety is and about how it manifests itself. And interestingly, I just asked you, as we're getting closer to the prospect of, the competition and we're going through some of the quiz questions, you both said that your anxiety is elevated a little bit. So I was just wondering, why else do we get nervous? What happens? What triggers anxiety?
I guess it may either be based on previous experiences when something hasn't gone to plan, and our mind remembers that, right? So our hippocampus, our memory store will remember a negative event and a negative emotional experience. And if we go into a similar situation, then that may trigger some kind of nerves from it's called the limbic system part of the brain, the amygdala, and it's detecting some threat. Yeah, so this may not go well. It did not go well last time, so prepare for the worst. Yeah, so we have a stressor come up from a similar situation. So it may be a penalty kick that was missed, and the next time that situation comes up, if it didn't go well, then the footballer is associating his next penalty kick with a previous negative experience.
I guess when I explain this to athletes, I borrow very generously from Steve Peters, who talks about the idea of the chimp. And I find it really, really resonates well with them because it can feel very simple. But once you get the concept, it also helps you actually deal with it and handle it. And so the chimp theory breaks down our brain, or our decision-making elements of our brain, into 3 areas. So we've got our kind of computer that's sitting there in the background, whirring away, focusing on all the habits that we have that we don't really have to think about, which is very handy because it's something like 35,000 decisions we have to make every day. Most of them are minute. My arm is itchy, I'll scratch it. If we actually had to think about those things, we'd never get anything done. So that just sits there in the background working away. Then we've got our human, which is really rational and sensible and makes really good quality decisions, going back into our memory and finding out what works for us, what worked last time, what should we do this time. And then we've got our chimp. And our chimp is super emotional, it's irrational, it works incredibly quickly, so it normally gets there in front of the human. And it's triggered when we feel under threat. So the threats used to be, when back in caveman days, things that would physically hurt us, like a bear coming towards us, would be very valid to set off our threat element, that amygdala, and make us respond very quickly, very emotionally. We don't have many physical threats now. Some of the athletes I work with do. I work a lot with cycling, and if you are hammering it down a very steep mountain very, very fast, it is quite rational that your chimp's going to come out and tell you to stay safe. But most of the threats that we have in life are ego. So fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of embarrassment, fear that we've put lots of effort into training for something that we might not achieve. And so when one of those things comes along, our chimp absolutely kicks off, and it kicks off all of those physiological issues that we were talking about in our body. The reason I love using that kind of strategy for talking about it is it gives you some really clear things to do, because you can get to know your chimp much better. With athletes, I'll often name our chimps. I even give them a little chimp keyring that squeals when you press it, so that every time they feel their chimp coming out, they can squeal it, and it gives them a real awareness of what triggers their chimp. Because once you start to get to know it and what triggers it, then you can put in place really good strategies to handle it a lot better.
I'd just add to that, Josie, that I would use very similar analogies. And I think that psychoeducation with clients just allows them to normalise their experiences. So I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of the clients that I work with will feel this fear of anxiety, or that I shouldn't be feeling like this, or that I cannot perform well whilst feeling some kind of stress or anxiety. And actually just understanding that that piece around how does my mind work, and actually when I feel this stress that might lead to anxiety, it's actually my mind trying to protect me. It's actually that chimp area trying to keep me safe, my survival instinct kicking off, rather than something bad happening to me, right? And it's kind of recognizing that this chimp can be overprotective or over emotional, and like you say, learning strategies to manage that part of the brain rather than trying to stop that part of the brain bringing these tricky thoughts or feelings, because actually anxiety is just a very normal human natural emotion to feel.
And athletes will often come in almost wanting to shut down that chimp, and it's like, I don't want this bit. I don't want to deal with it. I just want it not to kick off anymore. And actually really understanding your chimp's looking after you. We'll often explain it that if you've been walking down the road at night and someone is walking a little bit too closely behind you, your chimp is the thing that sets the hairs on the back of your neck, that makes you become much more aware. How can I keep myself safe right now? I don't feel quite comfortable. We don't want to get rid of our chimp. We just want to get to know it. And that's why we name it. And I love the names that people come up with for their chimp. And we'll often joke about it, but it's really good that actually it separates it a little bit from us. So these emotional, irrational thoughts aren't us, they're our chimp. And that means you can have a conversation with it and almost pull it back down to earth, rather than just kicking off every time you feel under threat.
I think it's interesting that you've talked about the chimp model, and I suppose my big gripe with it is that it's a metaphor, and that whenever you create a metaphor with somebody, the problem is they can reduce the amount of control over the chimp that they have, so they could interpret their chimp as being out of control and essentially giving it agency within them. But at the same time, I definitely see how it's a very useful way of explaining the component parts of human experience. Guys, I have a question. You know, you've talked about how there's different ways of people understanding their somatic and cognitive side, and you've talked about experiences and memories as well, about how that can be a stressor, and then you've talked about the actual stressors and the demands. What works with athletes when you're, at the coalface, and does that differ, in a competition arena versus in a one-to-one client meeting 2 months out? Like, do you try and manage anxiety differently in those different contexts?
I guess in my opinion, it would be helping a client to build tools within their training environment and introducing something called pressure training. So exploring with that client, what are your stressors? Is it people watching? Is it penalty shootouts? What is it that stresses you? And therefore introducing some of those demands into the environment. Granted, you can never completely create a competitive atmosphere within a training environment, but you can introduce some stressors and therefore give the client the opportunity to practice some of those skills and tools that we're working with them on within that training environment. So they've got some tried and tested routines. In other words, feel well resourced going into their competition, that when anxiety shows, I kind of know how I'm going to manage it. This is a tried and tested routine.
And I'd say, taking on from exactly what Jo said there, that if you then work with them to set the goal for that next competition to be not I'm going to win or I'm going to get a personal best, but I am going to handle that stressor better, they get a really good opportunity to practice it in the real world. And actually focusing on handling the stressor better usually means they do better because they're not stressed, they're not wound up, they're not anxious. So you can take what you do in the pressure training into actual competition too, to give that extra practice in a way that will still help them perform well.
And I would add to that how we perceive a stressor becomes really important in terms of our physiological and psychological response to that stressor. So there's some really interesting research into what we call challenge and threat states in psychology. Now, a challenge state would reflect an athlete who is looking at a demand or a stressor ahead in a really positive way. So a swimmer might look at their final in terms of I feel in control, I've got a plan, I'm focusing what I can do, and I feel competent to swim towards my best in this race ahead. What's interesting is the physiological response underlying that. So that swimmer might, before their final, still have a racing heart, butterflies in their tummy. So a kind of typical stress response that we've talked about earlier. Yet what's really interesting is there's a decrease in vascular constriction or blood vessel constriction from normal resting levels. So therefore, blood is delivered really efficiently to the brain, which is important for mental functions such as concentration, decision-making, communication, etc. And it's also really important, obviously, for energy and oxygen to get around the body to muscles, for physical movement, skill execution, etc. Now, the opposite to this would be a threat state. So perhaps another swimmer is looking at their final and feel under-resourced. Yeah, so they don't feel in control. They don't have a strategy. Maybe they don't have a race plan, or they're focusing all the things that could possibly go wrong. And although their physiology might feel the same to them, they might still have a racing heart, butterflies in the tummy, those typical stress responses. Actually, what we're seeing in that swimmer would be vascular or blood vessel constriction from normal resting levels. So in other words, the amount of blood pumped from the heart is largely unchanged, and therefore the delivery of the good stuff like glucose, oxygen to the brain and muscles becomes inefficient and isn't helping that athlete to perform at their best. So in a nutshell, if we can help athletes to feel well-resourced in dealing with stressors, whether that is people watching, whether that is certain skill execution, then actually we can help them to look at those stressors or demands in a positive way and influence their physiology, which in turn can influence performance.
Yeah, I'd say one of the most important pieces of psychoeducation you can do from that is actually to help people realise that nerves are good. And instantly we might think nerves are really bad, we have to get rid of them all. But actually, if people start to understand nerves are good because they get you to the right level of activation, they make you pumped up and in a really good place to go and compete, then they can start to translate them in their brain. Those feelings in our bodies get translated as, this is a good thing, I am up for it, I'm off to go and do fantastically, rather than, oh my God, I'm too nervous, I can't do this, I'm going to shut down, I'm not going to go, I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think what we've essentially done in the field of psychology is we've pathologized what is essentially a perfectly normal emotion to have, we've kind of got this idea that anxiety is a really bad thing. We need to get rid of it. I remember playing with, I'm not going to name him, but one guy who I used to play basketball with, basically in the 10 minutes before tip-off, he would be in the bathroom like 3-4 times in 10 minutes. And I remember talking to him one time about kind of pre-game nerves and anxiety. It's like, are you nervous? No, absolutely not. Don't get nervous. But he had this kind of real stigma around being nervous and being anxious about something. Like, that's not the sort of thing that you do if you're an athlete. You're not supposed to get nervous. You're supposed to be able to handle all of these things. So I think absolutely, understanding that it's a perfectly normal, natural emotion to have is the first step towards being able to deal with it.
For sure, I'd even go to the extent of saying to clients, your mind's doing a really good job for you. It's actually working really, really well. Let's not look at your mind as dysfunctional. Let's look at this this stress you're feeling as actually your mind is working perfectly well for you. It's just being a little bit overprotective at this point in time.
So, again, just to kind of bring it back and check in on our own anxiety, we're going to have questions 3 and 4 now, which are the last 2 questions to decide who's going to win and pick who's going to wrap. So question 3, Great Britain won 1 gold medal at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. Only 1. Who won it?
Is in the nation that won it?
Well, no, as in the
athletes.
athlete or athletes. Little hint there. Great Britain won 1 gold medal at the 96 Olympics in Atlanta. Who won that medal?
Is Atlanta a real place?
Yeah, I've been there actually. Yeah,
okay.
It's lovely. Question 4, final question. Name all 7 heptathlon events. And you get a bonus point if you get them in the right order. So name all 7 heptathlon events, bonus point if they're in the right order. And again, you can play along at home. You can tweet us at EPM Podcast, or you can leave a comment on the website, which is 80percentmental, allwords.com. I'll edit out all of this because it's not great for radio, to be honest.
Sounds good.
Yeah, fair dues.
How do you test where we've actually written them down?
Well, I'm gonna use the honor system, and
Right.
we're all professionals here. So the answers to the questions. Question 1 was, which footballer was charged with assault for executing a perfect flying karate kick on a fan in 1995? And the answer was the one and only Eric Cantona.
I got that right.
And there was such
Amazing.
nervousness around that question. Oh, am I going to get it right? I don't think I've got the right answer. That cognitive anxiety whirring around there, but came through.
Absolutely.
Question 2, Serena Williams, the greatest athlete of all time. I met her once, actually. Another story for another time. Serena Williams is the greatest athlete of all time, but how many times has she won Wimbledon? Does anyone get this?
I guess 7.
I put 6.
Hugh?
I put 7, and Navratilova to win with 9.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Josie, did you get the bonus point as well with Navratilova?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're all tied. Question 3.
I know. I was 6, so I'm
Joe's
one down now.
Right.
Oh, honestly.
All to play for. Question 3. Great Britain won 1 gold medal in the Atlanta Olympic Games. Who won it?
Oh, Pinsent and Redgrave.
It was Pinsent and Redgrave. Absolutely.
Ooh.
Joe, you're shaking your head.
that.
You didn't get that one.
I didn't get that.
Can I ask who you did put?
I put an event rider who you probably haven't heard of, Ginny Leng.
Yeah, no, it wasn't it. Oh, sorry. Go on, Hugh. Who do you have?
Eddie the Eagle, but I don't think that is right. That's great. It's a great
right.
show if you watch it.
It is a good film, actually. I like that. So I believe Josie's in the lead going into the final question. Yeah. So the final question was, name all 7 heptathlon events, and a bonus point if they're in the right order. So anyone want to have a go?
I'll try a couple. So 800 javelin, 100 hurdles, High jump, long jump, shot put, and I can't remember the other one.
Oh, close. We got 6 right. Anyone want to hazard a guess at the other one?
I have them.
I actually had exactly the same. I couldn't remember the 7th for the life of me.
Hugh, you've got them?
So the answers are in the correct order: 100 meter, hurdles, high jump, shot put, 200 meter, long jump, javelin, and 800 meter.
He's done it.
Impressive.
He's got it right.
Nice.
And he's got the bonus question. Hugh,
Yeah.
somehow, you've, despite Eddie the Eagle, you've come back and won.
Yeah. No, I really liked Joe's honesty. So the decision as to who to rap is going to be dum dum dum. Off you go, Joe. Then.
Now or later?
What we'll do is you can do it now.
No.
I'll put in a little beat behind it in the editing, to make it sound professional. So you can just spit a few bars for us.
Okay, am I going to be allowed afterwards to decide if this actually makes a podcast or not? Yeah.
We'll see.
I signed away my rights now. It's all gone.
Before you start though, Joe.
Yeah.
Just tell what's your anxiety doing right now?
I think my chimp is saying, Joe, you're going to look like an absolute fool. Don't do this. But there's part of my rational brain almost going, what, Joe, what have you got to lose? You probably already said something daft, so you may as well go with it. My somatic anxiety, definitely. I feel like actually the backbeat is going to be my heart, because I feel like that's pumping pretty well right now. But yeah, let's give it a go. Let's see. I might only be able to do 10 seconds.
Let's
see where this goes.
Hit us with whatever you've got. I'll just wait until Hugh's finished answering his phone.
Sorry. It's not even my phone. I've just hung up with somebody randomly who's ringing to my other half's house.
Someone do me a beat.
Dum, tss, dum, tss, dum, tss, dum, tss,
Yo.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important public service announcement. At this point in the recording of the show, sports psychologist Joe Davis did actually perform a rap. Unfortunately, the police turned up, arrested Joe for crimes against hip-hop, and confiscated all recording equipment. The recording and Joe were subsequently returned with a warning that broadcasting the rap would constitute a criminal act. However, the makers of this program would like it to be known that if by the end of the week they get 500 shares of this episode, they will risk arrest and let you hear it. So if you want to hear Joe Davis rapping, go to www.80percentmental or at EPM Podcast on Twitter and share this episode. You won't regret it. Well, actually, you might. But do it anyway.
So if you're enjoying what you're hearing, you can subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and we'd love it if you could take the time to give us a lovely review as well. Don't forget, you can also follow us on Twitter at EPM Podcast, or check out the website 80percentmental.com, and 80% mental is all words. So we've kind of talked a little bit about strategies for managing somatic anxiety, cognitive anxiety. Just kind of bring it back to sport. You talked about a couple of the things that you use with clients, with athletes, but what are some of the other strategies that you might employ with athletes who are experiencing performance anxiety?
I mean, Josie, you talked a lot earlier about balancing demands with resources, and that's certainly actually a model I would draw out with a client or athlete sat in front of me, and almost look at this metaphorical set of weighing scales, right, whereby we want to feel well resourced and we want our resources to balance with the demands or what we're setting out to do. So one proactive strategy I would use would be to talk with an athlete around what kind of goals are you setting? Are you putting confidence into goals that you can personally influence, if not control? So I would call these with clients ingredient goals. So rather than setting an outcome goal, such as winning or medaling, which may depend on many, many variables outside of your control, can we start to set ingredient goals that are in keeping with what we can influence? So that might be to do with our technique, our strategy, our race plan, for example. And equally on that side of our weighing scales, I would place values. So what as an athlete do you want to bring in terms of personal qualities to this situation that you can put confidence in? What kind of person do you want to be? So whether that is disciplined or focused or it showing my passion or showing humility or sportsmanship. What kind of values do you want to bring? Because you can always move towards values even when the outcome is not going your way. So that would kind of be that one side of the scales. The other side of those scales, of course, is the resources. So how can you as an athlete prepare yourself to the best of your ability? What kind of experiences do you have that help you feel ready? Who in your support team can you work with to feel well resourced, and what strengths are you taking into this situation? So in other words, we're trying to influence either physically the reality of that athlete's resources and or their perception of their resources, because sometimes we'll come across people who can be the most well-resourced athlete in the world in terms of their strengths and experiences and preparation, but they don't necessarily believe that. So actually one of the most useful proactive strategies I find is helping an athlete set really realistic, personally controllable goals and thinking about the values that they can always work towards and they want to bring to a situation, and getting them to balance that with, okay, what resources do I have that make me feel ready to put trust into my performance?
So almost, Jo, you're kind of preempting anxiety occurring by looking at, how do we avoid it in the first place rather than managing it when it almost inevitably comes. The sort of proactive strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can go into reactive ones in a moment, but certainly from a proactive point of view, we're then helping that athlete to look at this situation as less of a stressor, right? A stressor doesn't have to be a stressor unless I perceive it to be so. So actually when this stressor occurs, there's a positive stress. We're going into that challenge state rather than that threat state that I spoke about earlier.
I think we can also take those values that Jo talks about and use them really proactively to look at not trying to fight anxiety the whole time. So what we naturally want to do is get rid of it and shoo it away and it doesn't exist. But actually, if we can be really honest with ourselves that it does exist and that's perfectly okay, and we don't have to rationalise it and we don't have to try and squash it and bat it away, we just have to accept that it's there and accept that we might well be feeling anxious because this competition really matters to us, or qualifying for the next thing we want to do is really important, or this exam is going to change our lives whether we pass or fail. Rather than trying to get rid of it, kind of go, yeah, we're anxious because it matters and that's okay. But rather than trying to override it and get rid of it, let's look at those values that Jo was talking about of what really, really matters to us and almost place those values over the anxiety. Because if we focus on the values, I really, really want to do this because passing this exam will get me into a university I'm desperate to go to, or qualifying here means I get to wear GB kit for the first time in the age group team. Knowing our values and how important that is means we can override the stressors and override that anxiety. And I often use the example of I do triathlon racing. Not very good, I love it, but I'm not great at it. I'm very easily led into wanting to quit halfway through. But what matters to me most in the world, my biggest value, is my daughter. And I want her never to give up, and I want her not to be like me. I want her to strive to always finish everything she sets out to do. So what kind of message does it give her if I quit halfway through something? The last thing I want to do is get home when she looks at me and goes, "Where's your medal, mummy?" And me say, "Oh, I didn't finish today." And so being able to remind myself of that value, that I want her to be proud of me, means I can override every single negativity that's going through my head in a race, because I am going to finish, because it really matters to me that she sees that's what you do and that's a good example for her. And if you can draw those things out of athletes and really help them see what drives them, what are they passionate about, what's their purpose, that really helps them accept that the anxiety is going to be there, but not have to fight it all the time.
I think it's a great point, Josie, and kind of when I talked about this kind of reactive strategy, I would work very similarly around helping athletes to accept anxiety will come and it will go and it will pass. And being able to make room for that anxiety rather than trying to get rid of it. Like, there's something in psychology called this ironic processing effect. And as soon as we try and get rid of something, it's almost like our mind turns into this Google search engine. So if I tell myself to get rid of anxiety, don't have those thoughts, don't have those tricky feelings, my mind will almost search for those. Have I got those thoughts yet? Are those feelings appearing yet? And almost it's like trying to ignore a really annoying sound, right? The more I try and ignore something, the more intense and louder it becomes. Whereas actually, if I can accept this is a normal human emotion and that it will come and it will pass and I'll have tricky thoughts or feelings, I can start to make room for them. And I very much work from something called an acceptance and commitment therapy approach, which is very much in keeping with what we're both talking about around, can I accept that emotions will come and pass, but can I commit to my values that are really important to me, that I can always choose to move towards. So, you know, a way I might put that to an athlete in very, very simple terms would be, you know, can I breathe around a tricky thought or feeling? Can I move around a tricky thought or feeling? Am I in control of my body right now? And if I can breathe and I can move, then I'm also managing my focus. And if I can breathe and move and focus, then I'm ready to go out and do what I want to do. And that's quite a helpful place to be grounding myself within.
You know, it's very interesting that you both talked about values and then you've brought it on to a therapeutical approach through using ACT. One of the things that I prefer to use is REBT and more of a cognitive behavioral approach. I think it's worth sort of just talking about briefly and maybe exploring the differences between the two. So how I tend to approach athletes with anxiety. So if an athlete's at the start line of a race and they feel anxious around those times, what I'll do is I'll educate them along how when it's Christmas time and they're waiting, you know, outside the living room to get their presents to see did Santa come, I ask them to tell me how excited felt. And they talk about they had their heart rate going, they had sweaty palms, they were jittery and full of energy. And then I'll say, right, you're at the start line. What are the physical feelings of that? And then they go, well, I've got sweaty palms, I've got my heart rate's going, I feel jittery and full of energy. And then I explain that the two things are exactly the same. It's the adrenaline rush you get from flight or flight. And the difference is in one of them, you're going, I'm under threat. In another one, you're going, I'm excited and ready. And if you appraise it as being, I'm excited and ready, and now I've got adrenaline, which is going to make my muscles contract faster so I can run faster, then that's actually them nearly getting like a superpower at the start of a race or a competition. I mean, admittedly, that's just one approach, but that's more like a cognitive reframe technique. Whereas your approaches of going towards like values, look, regardless of the outcome here, who are you and what do you want? I mean, there's a very different, two very different ways of approaching dealing with anxiety. Have you any thoughts on like which is best? And would you always do your way or do you do other ways? And that question's to both of you.
I definitely started more of your approach and I've definitely moved over more around towards acceptance and commitment. I guess the athletes I enjoy working with most, I'm working with them on a long term, and it's not just about fixing something, it's about really developing them as an athlete. And to get those real benefits of developing yourself as an athlete, it's about more than learning some really cool tricks to feel better when you're going off to compete. It's about feeling like the whole athlete, that there's more to you than just your sport. There's a real purpose behind what you're doing. And I've really found that understanding that purpose and those values can be incredibly powerful. So for example, a friend of mine who's an athlete was doing an Ironman race in France a couple of years ago, and the seat on her bike fell off. It literally snapped off, and she still had something like 40 miles to go on the bike. And most of us at that point would stop. Our bike's broken, we can't do anymore. She didn't. She stood up, and she still managed to pedal standing up all the way to the end of the bike section. And then she ran a marathon at the end. And when you say, why did you do it? Her goal wasn't, I wanted to be the fastest Iron woman in the UK, which it did make her. She's 74. But it wasn't about I want to win my age group. It was because the reason she wants to win her age group. And she is a passionate advocate for older people being active. And she runs a charity that gets older people being active. It helps deal with loneliness issues. It helps deal with not enjoying your life as you get older. And so she knew that by finishing this race, it would give her great publicity. It would give her that story. It would get people being more active. And so she knew that's why she did it. She had a purpose, and that purpose drove everything she did. And I find the real beauty and the privilege of being a sports psych is that you can work with people on those journeys. And when somebody comes back to you and go, I've worked out my purpose, or I've clicked, I know what my values are. That's probably the most satisfying moment I ever have as a sports psych. So it might be quite selfish working in that way, but I also find it can have a really good benefit for people.
I guess I'm reflecting on what both of you have said. Like Josie, I think part of the beauty of values, kind of as you've insinuated, is like we can always move towards them. They're ongoing. Goals we tick off, and either they're outcome based, we reach or we don't reach. Whereas values are something that we can continue to move and strive towards, and so they're a very grounding place to be. Changing someone's perceptions almost of their physiological symptoms. You're going, right, I've got someone on the start line, they're feeling some somatic or some cognitive anxiety, or can we reframe that? And I'd say actually, yeah, I would use that approach, because it's along similar lines of understanding the biology. Okay, my mind's trying to protect me. Can I relabel this as my performance state, or these physical feelings I feel as I'm competition ready? It doesn't have to be a bad thing that I'm feeling this racing heart or butterflies in my tummy, as long as I'm in this challenge state where I feel well resourced to go about what I'm going to do. So yeah, I would say I certainly don't disagree with that approach at all, and would be an advocate of that. I think the danger we might get into sometimes, in my experience from perhaps previous approaches I've taken, is trying to almost collude with an athlete that, yes, we're trying to diminish or we're trying to reduce anxiety, because then we get into this danger of that individual feeling like they're doing something wrong when they get anxious. And actually, like we've kind of reiterated throughout this podcast, anxiety is a very natural human emotion to feel. And so as soon as we start agreeing with clients that our goal is to reduce anxiety, that becomes problematic, because as soon as I start to feel anxiety, this is wrong, I'm doing sport wrong, or I'm doing things wrong. My goal would always to be build flexibility around anxiety.
So it's interesting that you kind of talked about that, and again, my approach to work is kind of based on mindfulness acceptance, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the stupid stuff that we've just done and what's going to come up next, what's going to happen in the future, and we're kind of very rarely in the present moment, and that's kind of where we need to be, and that's what mindfulness acceptance helps us to do. So I think focusing on the reduction of anxiety, what we're actually doing is we're self-monitoring. We're thinking, okay, well, am I anxious now? What do I need to do about it? Okay, how anxious am I now? Now what do I need to do about it? And it takes us away from being in the present moment, which is where I think the mindfulness acceptance approach is really, really useful. Having said that, what do you do? And I don't know if either of you who've ever kind of had experience of this, but what do you do when an athlete's anxiety is so intense that they just can't function? So paying attention to their anxiety is all very well and good, but when their anxiety is resulting in them physically shaking when they're trying to, I don't know, hit a snooker ball or serve a tennis ball, what do you do then? Because surely we do need to bring it down a notch.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, Pete. And I would come back to grounding exercises and working on, for example, some kind of somatic relaxation technique inbuilt within mindfulness. So that might be a breathing technique. So we know that when we slow our breathing, when we focus on a calming breathing rhythm, that we can start to change the intensity of some of the somatic symptoms we're experiencing. We might look to equally progressive muscle relaxation, for example, which incorporates intentionally physically creating some tension and then releasing it. So I agree with your point around sometimes the intensity of anxiety can disrupt performance. In that case, we might want to combine a mindfulness approach with some kind of somatic or physical relaxation techniques. Yeah,
I'd agree with all of those. I would also, over a longer term, start to really work with them on boosting their overall confidence so that they have evidence that they can go back to in the moments when they are working rationally and the anxiety isn't taking over, to remind themselves, I've done all the preparation I need to do for this. I've put every effort in that I could possibly do. I've practiced. I've worked hard. I've done this 10 times over before. I've done my imagery, so that they've got, when there are moments when they can think rationally, they've got lots and lots of evidence that's in their face. It's really high up in their memory to remember they don't need to be feeling anxious.
And actually, you've made me think of something else, Josie, kind of combining that with this whole identity piece and putting some perspective on a sporting performance. And I will never, ever look to diminish an athlete's ambitions or goals. If they say to me, I want to go and win a medal or I want to qualify for the Olympic Games, awesome, let's work towards that. But equally, I'm always really interested in this holistic approach with an athlete around their whole identity as a person. And it relates to what you said earlier about working with a whole person and their values around, well, what else in life is important, and can we put some perspective on this? Like, I'll give an example. One of the Army target shooters that I worked with had a really, really helpful perspective at competitions, and actually he didn't really show much anxiety. And when we had these conversations about it, he said, it's not life or death. I've been in Afghanistan, I've been in war zones, I've been, nearly shot, my mates died next to me. This shooting competition is not life or death. And so actually being able to put some perspective on things and looking at life as a whole and what this competition means in terms of not only my sporting journey, but my life journey, I think can be a really useful holistic approach to working with someone.
Pete, do we have any final questions? Because this has been an enjoyable podcast.
It has. It's been fantastic. So I wanted to ask you, if you're a coach, or if you're working with a coach, how would you know that an athlete is experiencing anxiety? What are the things that you can look out for? Because, like you say, cognitive anxiety is that sort of mental anxiety, the thought. So we don't know what's going on in an athlete's mind. And the somatic anxiety, sometimes we can maybe pick up on some of that, but other times, we can't. So how do you know that the athletes that you're working with are anxious? What can you look out for?
Often when I work with coaches, they will say the athlete doesn't perform as well in competition as they should from their training. And that tends to be quite a big indicator that there is something going wrong cognitively when they get to competition. And so that seems to be the biggest thing that coaches notice. They perform phenomenally in the numbers they give in training. They perform really well in practice, but they never live up to what they should be doing when they get out on a pitch. And the other thing I often notice with people that have a lot of anxiety around performance is the use of the word things like should or I must. And if you can really listen to specific language, that is them trying to live up to certain expectations that they've either set themselves or they've heard other people talk about them and where they should be, that can be a really big clue that there's probably some kind of high-level anxiety going on there.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. That's really fantastic advice. Joe, anything from you?
Yeah, I would only reiterate Josie's really good point around noticing inconsistencies. So, you know, coaches will tend to know these athletes really well as people as well as the sports person. So, you know, does this person tend to be really chatty, noisy, like really part of the team, leading team chats? Do they suddenly go into their shell, become very quiet, very backward, isolate themselves in a competitive situation? So I guess in some respects we can kind of use those classic fight, flight, freeze responses to frame this. So, you know, are we seeing an athlete uncharacteristically going to fight response? So maybe more snappy, maybe that sort of try too hard, over aggressive approach. Are we seeing this athlete go into a flight response? So are they feigning injury? You know, are they trying to come off the pitch? Are they trying to avoid certain skills? Or maybe a freeze response. Does this athlete just suddenly look completely overwhelmed? And rabbit in the headlights and just incapable of making decisions. So it's kind of looking for those inconsistencies, but I think the fight, flight, freeze response can be quite useful in just noticing certain symptoms of anxiety as well.
And then I suppose the next question would be, you know, what would you encourage a coach to do about that? If he's noticing that an athlete's anxious, but the athlete's not saying so or not coming forward, you know, how would you encourage a coach to maybe handle that situation?
Encourage opportunities to talk about it, and I think the biggest influence I've had on getting people to open up about anxiety is actually to normalize it. So that piece we talked about around normalizing how the brain works, and actually everyone feels anxiety, and we've got this chimp or danger detector, limbic system, whatever we want to label it as, that detects threats and dangers in our environment. So it's perfectly natural that as human beings we feel emotions such as anxiety in whatever shape or form, and so that normalizing and inviting, encouraging opportunities to talk about these things would be my first port of call.
And I'd add to that, don't try and pull them aside and talk about it one-to-one, because that feels really defensive. It feels like there's something wrong with you. But if you can have group chats about it and you do team workshops, that really helps with that normalizing, because everybody then starts talking about how they might be feeling. And because everybody gets some level of anxiety, it really helps you to realize you're not alone and you're not the only one feeling like that. And so that can help with that normalization.
Awesome. Fantastic. Before we go, Josie, you've got a new book coming out. Is that right? I
do. Well, I've got two. So in October is a book called The Psychology of Exercise. And so it's not on the sports side at all, but it's looking at what is more likely to motivate us to exercise and what those barriers would be. And it breaks it down into, there's a chapter on the theories, but then it breaks it down into psychology of exercise for children, for teenagers, for adults, for retirees, for those with health conditions, and for those with exercise addiction. So it's a real kind of go-to book for anyone working in healthcare or coaches or PTs trying to get regular people exercising, for some good ways to do that are all really evidence-based.
Awesome. And Joe, your rap CD's coming out by Christmas, is that right?
Yeah, Christmas release. So it's gonna be a hit. I can tell. I'm backing myself.
I'll buy it.
Thanks,
I'll buy it. I'll buy it.
Out of pity, yeah.
All right. Well, so thank you so much to our guests today. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Josie.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Joe.
Yeah, really good to come online.
And as always, thank you, Hugh, as well.
No bother, Pete. I'm glad I was here.
I'm glad you were here as well. You're supposed to be here.
I think. Thank you, Pete.
You're all very welcome. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of stuff in today's episode, and I hope that our listeners have found it useful. We've talked about what actually happens when we get nervous, and we've discussed some of the ways that anxiety manifests itself. So the cognitive anxiety, the thoughts, the self-doubt, the worry. We've talked about the somatic anxiety, so the physical sensations or the perception of those physical sensations, the butterflies, the shortness of breath, etc., etc. And quite interestingly, in the first part of the show, our guests experienced anxiety in different ways as well, so demonstrating that not everybody experiences it the same way. The other thing was that as the show went on and as the prospect of performing a freestyle rap grew closer, the anxiety pattern shifted and changed. So actually we go more anxious as competition or whatever it is that we're anxious about gets nearer, but then it kind of disappears a little bit as well once we actually start doing it. So we learned what we can look out for and what we shouldn't do about anxiety, what we can and can't do. And we heard about various techniques to cope with it and manage it, and just to sit with it, to sit with that discomfort of being anxious as well. So I hope you enjoyed what you heard on today's episode. Please do subscribe wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a fantastic review if you can spare the time to do that. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Well, I won't see you. It's a podcast.